How much money would you pay to catch the men who killed the president? In the case of the American public following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, newspapers across the country proclaimed the price on the heads of the killers. $50,000 for the apprehension of John Wilkes Booth, $25,000 for the apprehension of David Harold, $25,000 for the apprehension of John Surratt. On the morning of April 15th, just a day after he had shot President Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth remained in bed, resting from his injury and long night of riding. David Harold, meanwhile, rode to nearby Bryantown with Dr. Mudd to find a carriage to transport Booth. Just outside of town, Harold caught sight of the blue jackets of Union cavalrymen, and without any explanation to Mudd, Harold turned his horse around and sped back to the house where Booth was resting. Dr. Mudd, meanwhile, continued into the town and ran into the same Union soldiers, who stopped and questioned him. And this is where, from these soldiers, Dr. Mudd finally learned the shocking truth about the man who had just shown up at his doorstep the night before. The president was dead, and the killer was hiding in Mudd's own home. And suddenly, this doctor held Booth and Harold's fate in his hands. If he told the soldiers that Booth was only a few miles away at his farm, the manhunt would end that very day. But here's the decision that has come to define Dr. Samuel Mudd. He decided at that moment not to reveal to the Union troops that he was sheltering Lincoln's killer. Instead, he went about his tasks as normal, then rode back home in order to confront Booth himself. And this is where Mudd's role in history becomes so controversial. If he had truly not known about Booth's assassination plot prior to speaking with the soldiers in Bryantown, why did he continue to protect Booth after learning the truth? But although Dr. Mudd had decided not to turn Booth in, this doesn't mean he wanted to play any more of a role in protecting the fugitive than he needed to. When he returned to his farm, Mudd berated the actor for lying to him and putting his family in danger. Then he ordered Booth and Harold to leave at once. He even gave them an incentive to leave his property as soon as possible, promised that if they left right then, he would help them with their escape. Mudd gave Booth the name of a Confederate operative named Samuel Cox, who lived along the route the fugitives would need to take into Virginia. And unlike Mudd, Samuel Cox was smart enough to avoid letting the president's killer sleep in his house, and so he directed the men to wait in a thicket in the pine trees near his farm. He told the pair the next day he would send someone to them who could help them with their next problem, which was how to get across the Potomac into Virginia. Now, Captain Cox knew that there was only one man in the area who had the ability to smuggle the president's killer across the Potomac without getting caught. That man was a farmer who lived about 30 miles away. His name was Thomas Jones, and he was a member of the Confederate Secret Service who had successfully smuggled hundreds of spies across the river during the war. On Easter Sunday, Jones met the fugitives in the thicket and laid out a plan, one that was actually pretty genius for the way it subverted all expectations about what Booth's next move would be. Jones knew that the river was being watched closely, so he proposed that Booth and Harold should wait and lie low rather than continuing to run. After a few days with no sightings of Booth, the manhunters would assume the killer had successfully slipped into Virginia. When that happened, the tight net around the Potomac would be lifted as the focus of the search moved south. On the night of April 20th, Jones led the fugitives to a small boat he had hidden on the banks of the river. Booth and Harold climbed aboard and began to paddle across the river. But instead of making it to their destination, the pair managed to get themselves lost in the thick fog that covered the water. After a long night of paddling in the darkness, they actually ended up further north in Maryland than where they had started. The fugitives didn't actually manage to successfully make it into Maryland until the morning of April 23rd. By this time, the authorities who had spoken with Dr. Mudd were starting to close in. With cavalry patrols around every corner, Booth and Harold found themselves receiving less and less from Confederate contacts in Virginia than they had expected. The only accommodation that they had was on the night of April 23rd, and this was done by forcing their way into the house of a freed slave named William Lucas. Booth threatened Lucas and his family with the exact same bloody knife that he had used to slash Henry Rathbone, who was the man in the box with Lincoln that night. Out of fear for their lives, Lucas and his family gave up the cabin and slept on the porch while Booth and Harold spent the night inside. The next morning, Booth then forced Lucas to give up his team of horses and also demanded that his son Charles Lucas lead them to their next destination, which was Port Conway. And in Port Conway, they met a Confederate soldier named Willie Jett. Jett would become their last guide as the race between Booth and his pursuers were finally nearing its end. Jet led Booth and Harold across the Rappahannock River to the home of a man named Randolph Payton. When they arrived at the house, Randolph was not home. Only his 2 unmarried sisters were. And ironically, the man who had just assassinated the president thought it was morally unacceptable to be at the home alone with 2 unmarried women. And so Jet led the pair further up the road to the home of a man named Richard Garrett, who owned a 500-acre farm called Locust Hill. This farm would become infamous as the last stop along Booth's 12-day flight from justice. Jet spoke with the elderly Garrett and introduced Booth as a wounded Confederate soldier returning from the field under the fake name of James Boyd. Garrett took Booth in, offering him supper and a bed. But only a few miles away, Union troops that were part of the 16th New York Cavalry moved into the area and were rapidly closing in. Edward Doherty and the cavalry company that he commanded were the group of men who would finally bring Booth to justice, and they had traveled to Port Conway on April 25th to search for Booth in this area. And they couldn't know it at the time, but they were only a single day behind Booth and Harold. In Port Conway, the soldiers spread out and began interviewing locals. It didn't take long until one of the detectives with the group interviewed a fisherman named William Rollins, who had spoken with Booth the day before. Rollins revealed that he had spoken with a man with a broken leg. He said that the man had crossed on the ferry along with a small group of Confederate soldiers only the day before. The detective pulled out a picture of Booth and asked if it was the same as the man with the broken leg. Rollins said that it was. Rollins also told them that Willie Jett was courting a woman who lived in the nearby town of Bowling Green, which was where they might find him. And the soldiers mounted their horses and took off towards Bowling Green, where they successfully found and captured Willie Jett. In a twist of fate, though, the soldiers were so focused on riding to town in pursuit of Jett that they actually rode right past the front gate of the Garrett farm where Booth and Harold were staying. And back on the farm, Booth and Harold saw this cavalry storm past, and even though the soldiers kept riding, the fugitives knew that their time was running short. Meanwhile, John Garrett, the son of old Richard Garrett, the man who owned the farm, watched the 2 men's frightened reaction to the passing soldiers and started to grow suspicious. He decided to lay a trap. John Garrett told Booth and Harold that they would need to leave his father's farm the next morning on April 26th. He said they could stay one more night, but this time he would not let them sleep in the house. He offered them the nearby barn, and as soon as the pair had entered the barn for the night, William Garrett snuck to the front door and locked the barn shut from the outside. And as this is going on, back in Bowling Green, Doherty and his men interrogated Willie Jett, who told the detectives everything, including that Booth was staying only 3 miles down the road. Jett even offered to guide the soldiers to the Garrett farm personally. Cavalrymen arrived at the gates of the Garrett farm around 2:30 a.m. They headed to the house first, capturing the elderly Richard Garrett and demanding that he reveal where the killer was hiding. And this is when John Garrett emerged and told the soldiers that the men that they were looking for were already locked inside the tobacco barn. The soldiers moved in and surrounded it. Inside the barn, Booth and Harold had heard the commotion outside and woken up. They tried to open the door, only to find that it was locked. They kicked at the door, but it didn't break. Now the fugitives could hear the soldiers on horseback moving outside. The final confrontation that had been 12 days in the making was here. And this time, there was nowhere for John Wilkes Booth to run. And once the 16th Cavalry surrounded the tobacco barn, Booth's fate was pretty much sealed. The question now was whether the fugitive would allow himself to be taken alive, or if his last moment would end in a hail of gunfire. General Grant had been very clear that he wanted Booth to be captured alive in order to be questioned. There were still ongoing rumors that Booth might have been supported in his assassination plot by Confederate leaders, and Grant needed to find out if this was true. And if Booth was going to be captured alive, this final standoff at the farm needed to be handled correctly. The assassin was armed with a pair of revolvers and a rifle, which gave him a total of 19 rounds to fire before he would have to reload. And this meant that if the soldiers were decisive and moved in on Booth in the barn quickly, he would not be able to hold off the charging cavalrymen for longer than a few moments. But rather than charging the barn as soon as they knew Booth was inside, one of the detectives who was with Doherty seized John Garrett and ordered him to sneak into the barn and convince Booth to surrender. Garrett went inside, but he fled as soon as Booth began threatening to kill him. So the manhunters decided to take a new tactic. They spoke to Booth from outside, telling him he had to surrender or they would burn down the barn. Booth then asked for time to think about it, and amazingly, the authorities agreed to give him 15 minutes to think. Inside the barn, David Harold decided that he didn't want to be burned alive and begged the killer to let him go free. With 5 minutes left on the ticking clock, Harold's pleading finally convinced Booth to let him go. Booth yelled out that, quote, "There's a man here who wants to surrender awful bad." Harold was let out unarmed and quickly captured by the Union soldiers. Booth was now the only man left inside the tobacco barn. He still had 3 loaded guns beside him, and he had no intention of surrendering. Instead, he offered a counter-proposal to Doherty. He said, quote, "If you will withdraw your men in a line 100 yards from the door, I will come out and fight you." It is one of the strangest things to imagine, but Booth literally challenged all 29 men who were surrounding the barn to a duel at the same time. But the manhunters declined, and they lit the kindling that they had gathered around the barn. Immediately, the dry boards burst into flames. Booth now had 3 choices: surrender, fight to the death, or burn alive inside the barn. Still imagining himself as some sort of tragic hero, Booth decided to go out fighting. He grabbed his weapons and moved to the center of the barn away from the flames where he could fire at the barn door as the troops charged in. But what he didn't know was that he'd moved right into the firing range of one of the cavalrymen, a man named Boston Corbett, who watched him through a slit in the barn. Corbett moved quietly up to the slit and poked his revolver through the wall. He watched Booth and saw the killer raise his carbine rifle to his shoulder. Then Corbett fired a single shot at John Wilkes Booth. When he was asked later why he fired, Corbett said simply, "Providence directed my hand." The bullet struck Booth in the neck, severing his spinal cord. Instantly, he collapsed to the ground. Soldiers charged into the barn and carried Booth out, laying his limp body under a nearby locust tree. And just like the president that he had struck down, Booth did not die immediately from his wound. Instead, he lingered on for 3 hours, talking in whispers to the Union soldiers around him. In his last moments, Booth asked to see his hands, which he could no longer use or feel. He looked at them and muttered the words, "Useless, useless," and then he died. After 12 days, the man who had killed President Abraham Lincoln and then escaped a whole nation's quest for justice was finally dead.